The woman came lunging out of the rain, a thin shape breaking from the darkness at the edge of the harbor road, both hands slamming against the windshield of the lead SUV, her mouth already open in a scream. Sawyer Reed had a single instant to decide. And he decided. The driver stood on the brakes, the vehicle shuddering across the wet asphalt, before it stopped a hand's width from the woman, and behind him, the other 7 cars shrieked in a ragged cascade through the bone-deep cold of a February night in the Baltimore docks. Then silence. She was still standing there, shaking so hard he could hear the broken catch of her breath. Wrapped in a soaked and torn coat, her brown hair plastered against a face gone pale from hunger and from too many sleepless nights. But her eyes, gray-green and razor-sharp, lit with the clarity of someone long used to matters of life and death, were locked on Sawyer's. "There's a trap ahead," she said, her voice splintering between chattering teeth. "In the tunnel. They've got guns. They're waiting for you." Sawyer Reed didn't startle easily. 34 years old. The man at the head of an organization that controlled this city's entire transport network. A man who could make a whole room fall silent the moment he spoke. They called him the Quiet Man. And not because he was gentle. He looked at this soaked woman blocking the dark road, her shoes split open, her trembling hand still raised to wave him down. And he believed her, immediately and completely. "Lights off," he said, his voice no louder than before. "Everyone back up. Now." What Sawyer didn't yet know was that this woman had no idea who he was. She didn't care whether he was a kingpin or a nobody. She'd only seen a column of strangers about to drive straight into their deaths, and something in her, something 5 months on the street, still hadn't managed to kill, had pushed her out into the rain. What neither of them knew yet was that beneath the bridge where she'd slept for those 5 months, a secret sat sealed in the dark, a secret that had already killed her husband and was about to change both their lives. If this opening pulled you in, hit that like button to support us. Don't forget to share this video with the people you love. And subscribe right now so you won't miss the next part of the story. The convoy slipped backward into the darkness like an obedient creature, 8 pairs of headlights going out almost at the same time, and the harbor road sank back into the kind of thick blackness where only the rain could be heard tapping against metal roofs. Sawyer Reed opened the car door and stepped out. He did not hurry. People rarely saw him hurry. His leather shoes touched the wet asphalt without a sound, and he walked around the front of the car to the woman still standing there, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were trying to keep her body from breaking apart in the cold. Only when he drew closer did he see how small she truly was, and see clearly the way hunger had drained her from the inside, slowly, patiently, in the way only long months, not days, could do to a human being. He took off the black wool coat he was wearing, a heavy, warm coat made to fit him perfectly, and held it out to her without saying a word. She looked at it, then looked at him, her eyes still filled with the wariness of an animal that had been trapped too many times. She did not take it. "I don't need it," she said, though her teeth were still knocking together. Sawyer did not force her. He only folded the coat, placed it on the hood within her reach, then stepped back half a step to give her space. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice low and even, the kind of voice that 34 years of living in a world that did not forgive noise had worn smooth. She stayed silent for a long while, long enough that he thought she would not answer. "Marlene," she finally said. "Marlene Whitfield." He gave one small nod, as if that name were an important piece of information that needed to be carefully kept. "Sawyer," he replied, without adding a last name, without adding a title, without adding anything that might frighten her more. Behind him, a large figure separated from the second car and approached, his heavy footsteps stirring the puddles. It was Desmond Kelly, the man everyone in the organization called Dash, a large man with a shaved head and shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the remaining sky behind him. Dash looked at the soaked woman, then at the dark road ahead, then tilted his head toward Sawyer with the look of a man about to say what no one wanted to hear. "You really believe her?" Dash said, his voice lowered but still loud enough for Marlene to hear, and that was deliberate. "A stranger runs into the middle of the road, on the exact night we passed through here, at the narrowest point of the whole route. You don't think that fits a little too neatly?" He paused, then said plainly what everyone was thinking. "What if she is the trap? They push her out so we stop exactly where they want us." Marlene spun toward Dash, and in that moment, the fear in her eyes was replaced by something else, sharp and hot. "If I wanted you dead, she said, every word trembling from cold but not from fear. I only had to stand still under the bridge and let you keep going. I wouldn't have had to stand here in the rain begging a group of men I don't even know. She clenched both hands tightly. I don't care who you are. I just don't want to watch one more convoy drive into that place and never come out. The last sentence hung in the damp air, and there was something in the way she said, one more convoy, that made Sawyer tilt his head slightly, taking note, though he did not ask yet. Dash opened his mouth to speak again, but Sawyer raised one hand, and that alone was enough to make the large man fall silent. If she's lying, Sawyer said softly, his eyes still on Marlene, then we lose 10 minutes and a little caution. If she's telling the truth and we don't believe her, then we lose far more than that. He turned to Dash. Take 2 men around the back, through the old warehouse route, up to the high ground overlooking the tunnel mouth. Don't let anyone see you. Don't touch anyone. Just look. Then come back and tell me what's really down there. Dash looked at him for a moment, then nodded, the suspicion in his eyes not gone, but giving way to discipline. He signaled to 2 others, and all 3 vanished into the darkness along the edge of the road, so silently that after only a few seconds, Marlene could no longer hear them. Sawyer turned back to her. She was still standing there, and this time, when a harder shudder struck her, she reached out and took the coat from the hood, pulling it around herself without looking at him, as if accepting anything from another person was a kind of surrender. She had not allowed herself in far too long. The coat swallowed her whole, its hem hanging down to her knees. How long? She asked quietly. Until I know you're telling the truth, Sawyer replied. And after that, we'll deal with the rest. Dash moved upward through the darkness like a mountain that knew how to walk, so silently that even the 2 men following him had to strain their ears to know he was still ahead. They kept close to the stained brick wall of the old warehouse district, circled away from the main road, crossed a lot where weeds had pushed up through cracked concrete slabs, then climbed the rusted iron stairs leading to the roof of the 3-story warehouse that looked straight down onto the tunnel mouth. Every step could have cried out beneath the weight of a man as large as Dash, but he placed his feet the way only people who had survived by silence ever learned to do, shifting his weight onto the edge of each step, close to the bolts, where the metal trembled the least. When they reached the roof, the 3 men lay flat near the low wall, and Dash lifted the thermal binoculars to his eyes. For the first few seconds, he saw only darkness and rain, streaks of water cutting across the lens in gray lines. Then his eyes adjusted, and the scene below appeared with such clarity that his throat tightened. The woman had not lied about a single word. Right at the tunnel mouth, stretched across the road at about knee height, was a thin cable, a strong braided steel line tied from an iron stake driven deep into a crack in the concrete on one side to an anchor hook on the other, nearly invisible in the dark to anyone rushing toward it at high speed. A short distance farther inside, a box truck had been parked at an angle, blocking almost the entire tunnel road, leaving only one narrow opening that any vehicle making it past the first cable would be forced to slow down and squeeze into. And there, exactly there in that narrow gap, was where all the death had been arranged to wait. Dash swept the binoculars slowly from left to right. In the dark hollows between the tunnel supports, in the recessed space behind the truck, behind the tall stacks of wooden pallets along the side, he counted human shapes, each warm body glowing into a bright mark through the thermal lens, motionless in the way that could only belong to trained people, people who knew that movement was what betrayed a man in the dark. He saw the outlines of long guns resting against shoulders, saw one figure standing higher than the others on the concrete ledge to the north, holding a rifle fitted with a bipod and aimed straight at the road their convoy should have passed through only minutes earlier. This was not some impulsive robbery. This was not a handful of reckless men stumbling into an opportunity. Every position had a reason. Every firing angle locked down a stretch of road, and that entire cold structure said only one thing: that someone had spent money, time, and calculation to turn this narrow tunnel into a cage no one was meant to leave. The man standing in the middle of the group, the one the others occasionally tilted their heads toward as if waiting for a nod, stood with the posture of someone who had done this many times and had never grown used to failure. Dash lowered the binoculars for a moment, closed his eyes, and drew a long breath to force down what was rising in his chest. Not fear, but a cold and clear anger. The fury of a man who had just realized that he and the people he considered brothers had nearly walked straight into death without knowing it. He handed the binoculars to the man beside him so he could look for himself, confirm it with his own eyes, so that later, when they reported back, it would not be the word of one man, but the word of 3 men who had seen the same thing. Then he took out his phone, typed a short message without a single wasted word, and sent it back to Sawyer, who was standing with the woman at the foot of the road. The message said only that everything was real. The cable was real. The blocked truck was real. The men were real. And there were more of them than anyone standing on the ground could see. When the 3 men began withdrawing from the warehouse roof, slowly retracing the path they had taken, Dash turned his head to look down at the tunnel mouth one last time, at the dark cage someone had built in the night, and for the first time in many years, he felt grateful to a stranger. Grateful to a woman so thin she looked as if a strong wind could blow her away, the woman who had stood between the rain and the unfired bullets to push an entire convoy away from the grave already dug for them. Sawyer read the message on the phone screen, the pale blue light washing over his cheekbones for 1 second, before disappearing when he turned the phone face down. And when he lifted his eyes to Marlene, something in his gaze had changed, not surprise, but a quiet confirmation of what he had believed from the moment the car stopped only a handspan from her. He slipped the phone into the inside pocket of his coat. "You were right," he said softly. "Every detail." Marlene did not look relieved, and she did not look triumphant. She only gave a small nod, as if the fact that she had been right was something she had already known, and there was nothing worth celebrating in it. Sawyer looked at her for a long while, with the gaze of a man used to measuring people in only a few seconds, but now deliberately letting the silence stretch, because this woman did not fit into any category he had ready. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to understand that I'm not asking because I doubt you anymore. I'm asking because I don't understand." He paused. A cable stretched across the road in the dark, a rifle with a bipod on the concrete ledge, a vehicle parked at an angle to force the speed down. Those aren't things an ordinary person looks at and immediately understands. Most people would pass through there and see nothing unusual, but you looked into that darkness and read the whole intention behind it. "How did you do that?" Marlene was silent. She pulled the oversized coat tighter around herself, and her eyes moved away from him toward the black mouth of the tunnel at the end of the road, as if she were looking at something farther than that distance, farther than tonight. "Because I'm used to looking at things that are about to kill people," she finally said, her voice calmer now, the trembling from the cold only faintly left. "For a very long time, my job was to look at a person and know how many minutes they had left." Sawyer said nothing, only waited, and his silence carried a strange weight. It invited without pressing. "I used to be a nurse," Marlene continued. "Emergency room. Night shifts. For years, people were brought in on the worst night of their lives, and I had only a few seconds to decide who needed saving first, who could wait, and who had nothing left that could be done." One corner of her mouth lifted slightly, but it was not a smile. "When you do that long enough, you stop seeing the world the way other people see it. You look at a room and automatically know where the exits are. You look at a person and know where they're hiding the pain. And you look into a dark place, with a cable across the road and a truck blocking the way, and you know at once what it was built for, because the part of you that learned to read death never sleeps again." Sawyer stood still, and inside his mind, one piece had just fallen into its proper place. He turned his head toward the 3rd car in the convoy, where a man named Foley was leaning against the door, a quiet man of few words whom everyone in the organization knew had once nearly died from a wound no one thought he would survive. Brought into a hospital in the night and kept alive in a way even the doctor had called luck. Sawyer had never asked for the details of that night. Now he wondered whether the hands trembling from cold in front of him had once held on to the life of one of his men, in some emergency room beneath white lights, on a night this woman did not even remember anymore, because to her it had been only one night, among hundreds like it. He did not say that aloud. Some threads were best left to pull themselves together later. "You saved a lot of people," he said instead, and it was not a question. Marlene looked at him, and for the first time since she had thrown herself into the rain, something fragile passed across her face, a very small crack in the shell she had built around herself. "I used to think so," she said very quietly, "until I realized there are people you can't save, even when you do everything right. And there are people who still walk straight into death, no matter how loudly you warn them." She turned her face away. "Tonight is the first time in a very long while that anyone stopped long enough to listen to me." Marlene's last sentence still lingered in the damp air when Sawyer asked the question he had meant to ask for some time. but had waited until the right moment to say aloud, "Where do you live?" Marlene immediately went still, and her whole body seemed to shrink a little, the guardedness she had only just allowed to open, snapping shut again. "Why?" she asked, her voice sharper. "Why do you need to know where I live?" Sawyer did not move any closer, and his voice did not change. "Because you said you saw those men arrive this afternoon," he said. "You saw them stretch the cable, park the truck, choose their hiding places. Someone who was only passing by chance couldn't have seen that much. You saw it because you were nearby. I want to know how close you were, and I want to know whether they came here only because of us, or for another reason too." Marlene looked at him for a long time, and he let her look, without urging her, without repeating himself. He had learned that with people who had been betrayed too many times, pressure only made them close tighter, while patience was sometimes the only key. At last she turned, said nothing, only gave the faintest tilt of her head to signal for him to follow, and began walking along the foot of the embankment, away from the road, keeping to the darkness near the edge of the water, where the harbor overpass cast its shadow down in one thick black stretch. Sawyer followed her in silence, with Dash and another man behind him at a careful distance. The deeper they went beneath the bridge, the stronger the smell of standing water and rusted metal became, and the rain above them echoed down in a low, muffled sound, like the breathing of something enormous. Marlene stopped at a dry patch of concrete tucked close against the bridge pillar, and Sawyer understood at once that this was where she had been living, a shelter built from cardboard, folded into many layers with careful hands, lined inside with an old blanket that had lost almost all its warmth, everything arranged with an orderliness so painful it nearly hurt to look at, the neatness of someone still trying to hold on to the last scrap of dignity in a life where almost nothing remained. But it was not that shelter that made him stop. His eyes were drawn to the farthest dark corner beneath the bridge, where a small metal shipping container sat hidden behind a sheet of corrugated metal propped at an angle, an old container someone had dragged in here and abandoned, its door left partly closed. "How long has that been there?" Sawyer asked, his voice dropping lower. Marlene followed his gaze, and she lightly wrapped her arms around herself. "They dragged it in here a few months ago," she said. "At night. I didn't dare go near it." Sawyer walked toward it, each step slow, and Dash had already taken out a flashlight, holding it ready in his hand but not switching it on yet. When Sawyer reached the container door, he paused for one beat, then pulled the metal door open, and it gave a long shriek on rusted hinges, the sound ringing beneath the belly of the bridge before dying out. Dash turned on the light. The white beam swept into the container, and for one moment, all three men stood still. There was no cargo inside. There were traces of people. Several pieces of cardboard lay across the floor, with dirty cloth bunched into sleeping places, many sleeping places, pressed close together, as if several people had been held in that cramped space at the same time. Along the container wall, where Dash's light stopped, was a row of marks scratched into the metal paint, straight lines counting days, row after row, the trace of someone who had tried to hold on to time after everything else had been taken away. In the corner lay a pair of worn work boots, the soles peeling away from the toes, the kind worn by people who did heavy labor at construction sites or on the docks. And beside them, torn in half and discarded, was a pay stub, a thin piece of paper printed with blurred numbers, the name in the corner washed by water until it could no longer be read, but what it meant was chillingly clear. This had once belonged to someone who worked, someone with a job, someone with a name and a life, before being turned into something no longer allowed to have a name. Sawyer bent down, picked up the torn pay stub between two fingers, held it under the light, and a coldness that did not come from the rain ran down his spine. He had walked through many dark things in his life, had seen people do things to one another that most would never have to imagine. But this silent metal container, with the day marks of a desperate human being trying to cling to time, opened before his eyes something that even he needed one full breath to name correctly. He straightened, turned to look at Marlene standing at the edge of the light, her face pale in the darkness, and he understood that tonight had become something entirely different from what he had thought when the convoy began to move. Marlene looked at the torn pay stub in Sawyer's hand, and something inside her broke very softly, not a sob, but the sound of a wall that had stood too long finally beginning to crack. She stepped back, leaned one shoulder against the cold concrete bridge pillar, her arms still wrapped around herself, and when she spoke, her voice was different now, no longer carrying the defensive sharpness of a stranger, but lower, thinner, as if these words had been pressed down for so long that even escaping now caused pain. "You want to know why I'm here," she said. "Why someone who once had a job, once had a home, would sleep under a bridge for months, only a few steps from that container, without daring to go near it." She lifted her eyes to him. "Because I came here to watch it. Because I'm the only one left who knows what it is." Sawyer stayed still and did not interrupt her. He set the pay stub down carefully, as if it belonged to someone who deserved respect, then waited. "I wasn't always like this," Marlene continued, and her eyes looked past him, into a part of her life that had closed behind her. "I had a small apartment on the north side of the city. I worked night shifts at the hospital, came home when the sun was coming up, slept a few hours, then went back again. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was mine, and I had someone to come home to." She stopped, and for the first time, her voice trembled not from cold. "My husband's name was Russell. He worked as a safety inspector at the harbor. His job was to check scaffolding, inspect cables, make sure the people working there were properly protected. He was the kind of man who believed that if a rule had been written to keep human beings alive, then it had to be followed. No exceptions, no envelopes passed under tables, no looking the other way." Something almost like pride passed across her face, then faded quickly. That very trait is what got him killed. Sawyer shifted slightly, and behind him, Dash turned off the flashlight, letting darkness settle again around the three of them, as if this story needed to be told in the dark. "Almost a year ago," Marlene said, "Russell discovered something at the harbor he wasn't supposed to see. There were containers being moved in and out on schedules that didn't match any paperwork. There were people brought into work and then disappearing. No contracts, no names on any list, no one reporting them gone, no one reporting them leaving." Russell started writing everything down. He was an engineer. He recorded everything: dates, numbers, hours. He didn't know how to do anything except record it accurately. She clenched her hands so tightly that her knuckles turned white. He took what he found to the place people said he was supposed to take it. He believed in procedure. He believed that if you handed the truth to the right people, the truth would take care of the rest. Her voice broke. 6 months later, they found him at the foot of a scaffold in the Eastern Harbor District. They said he slipped. They said it was a workplace accident, that he hadn't clipped his safety harness correctly. A short laugh broke out of her, so bitter it sounded like a sob. Russell, the man who spent his whole career making other people clip their safety harnesses. The man who never stepped onto a ladder without checking it 3 times. They wanted me to believe he forgot to clip his own. She slowly shook her head. "I went to the police. I spoke up. I gave them everything I knew. And I saw it on their faces. The look of people who had already decided the matter before I even opened my mouth. A few weeks later, I lost my job. They said it was staff reduction. Then I lost my apartment, because I no longer had wages to pay for it. Then I lost the right to be believed. Because a woman who loses her husband, her job, and her home, but keeps insisting there's a conspiracy. Do you know what people call that? They call it grief, making her lose her mind." She lifted her head, and in those gray-green eyes there were no tears left, only the dry hardness of someone who had cried herself empty a very long time ago. "So I came here, to the very place Russell had seen, because I thought that if I stayed close enough, long enough, then one day I would see what he saw, and I would have something no one could brush aside anymore." She looked toward the dark, silent metal container in the corner. "And then they dragged that in here, right in front of me." Sawyer let the silence stretch for 1 beat, then asked the question he needed answered, his voice still low and in no hurry. "The name," he said. Russell wrote down what he saw. "Did he know who those containers belonged to?" Marlene nodded slowly, and when she spoke the name, she said it with the caution of someone who had carried it inside her for so long that it had become a weight. "Voss Maritime," she said. "Conrad Voss's company." Sawyer did not move, but behind him, Dash shifted his weight slightly from one foot to the other, and that small sound said the name meant more to them than they allowed to show. "Russell knew Voss from inspections," Marlene continued. "At first, he even respected him. The whole city respected him. Conrad Voss was the man people invited onto stages to present awards, the man whose name was carved into hospital walls, onto school gates, the man who paid to build housing for the homeless, and then stood smiling warmly in front of cameras, so warmly that no one could ever imagine what was behind it." She gave a small laugh. one without the slightest trace of joy. Russell once told me he was living proof that a man could buy the respect of an entire city, as long as he spent enough money in the right places. He said it with admiration. He had no idea how true that sentence really was. Marlene closed her eyes for a moment, as if turning through the pages of her husband's lost journal. Russell discovered that the people brought to work at Voss's harbor operations weren't workers in any sense the law would recognize. They were people who had come from very far away, promised a job, a wage, a decent life. They paid for that promise, some with everything they had, some by borrowing until they were in debt to the very people who brought them here. And when they arrived, their papers were taken from them, with the excuse that they had to be kept for processing, and then they were never given back. They were told they still owed money for travel, food, and lodging, and that they had to work to repay it, and that debt kept growing in a way no wages could ever catch up with. They worked the longest shifts, in the most dangerous places, slept where no one could see them, and if anyone resisted, if anyone demanded to leave, there were ways to make them silent and to frighten everyone who remained. She opened her eyes. Russell called it by its proper name. He said this wasn't labor exploitation. This was human trafficking, only hidden behind bills of lading and the official stamps of a company the whole city trusted. Sawyer listened to every word, and inside his mind, the scattered pieces of the past several months began arranging themselves into a picture he did not want to see. He reported it, he said quietly, not as a question, but as a way of repeating what she had told him, as if to make himself believe he understood correctly. He took the truth to someone he thought would protect it. Marlene nodded, and that was his last mistake, because the person he trusted with the file turned out to be on the list of people Voss's money had already touched. Russell didn't know that. He went to them with an entire folder of carefully recorded documents, believing the truth was strong enough on its own. He didn't understand that in Voss's world, the truth is only strong when it's in the hands of someone powerful enough to force other people to listen. In the hands of an ordinary harbor inspector, it was only a death sentence. Her voice dropped until it was almost only breath. They didn't have to do anything loud. One morning, he went to inspect a scaffold the way he had done thousands of times, and he never came home. They wrote exactly the words they wanted into the report. A slip, an oversight, a safety harness left unclipped. And that report was signed by people I couldn't touch, stamped by a system I couldn't move. She looked straight into Sawyer's eyes in the darkness. Russell died because he believed the truth was enough. I survived all the way here because I no longer believe that. I know now that the truth doesn't save anyone by itself. Someone has to be willing to carry it forward. Someone they can't buy, can't threaten, can't make fall from some scaffold one morning. She stopped. I've waited 5 months under this bridge to find someone like that. I don't know whether tonight that person is you. Sawyer did not answer the question hanging in the darkness right away, because he understood that promises spoken too quickly were the cheapest kind, and this woman had already been promised too much by people who had later abandoned her. Instead, he did something else. He turned to Dash and said a few quiet words. And Dash, though the suspicion in him had not entirely faded, nodded and stepped away with the other man, leaving Sawyer alone with Marlene in the darkness beneath the bridge, with no guard at his side, no weapon in his hand, a man the whole city treated with caution, deliberately placing himself unprotected before a stranger. He did it on purpose, and Marlene understood that he had done it on purpose. I don't know whether tonight I'm the person you've been waiting for, Sawyer said. I'm not a good man, Marlene. I won't stand here and pretend otherwise. My hands have done things I don't tell anyone about, but there are things I don't touch. Never. And the first of them is turning human beings into cargo. What Voss is doing, what you've just told me, is exactly why he and I can never sit at the same table. Last spring, he sent someone to meet with me. He wanted to use my transport route to move what he called cargo. I refused. I didn't ask what that cargo was. I only had to look into his man's eyes to know I didn't want any part of it. Now I understand what I refused. Marlene looked at him for a long time in the weak light spilling down from the distant road, and there was something in the way he admitted his own darkness, instead of hiding it, that made her believe him more than any decent promise could have. A person willing to speak of the worst parts of himself often had less reason to lie about the rest. She stood still for a while, then lifted her hand to her chest. Feeling along the seam in the lining of the old coat she still wore beneath his wool coat, the clumsy stitches she had sewn herself one night 5 months earlier, she dug her nails into the seam and yanked hard, breaking the thread in short pieces. and from inside the fabric she pulled out a small object wrapped in several layers of plastic to keep out moisture. A tiny memory card, something small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, but heavy enough to have weight on her every single day. Russell didn't only write things down in a notebook, she said, her voice so quiet that Sawyer had to lean closer to hear. His notebook disappeared with him. They took it to make sure nothing was left, but he was more careful than they thought. He backed everything up on this. Pictures, container numbers, ship schedules, even recordings he made secretly when people thought he was only some foolish inspector checking scaffolds. He gave it to me 1 week before he died. He told me to hide it carefully. He told me not to give it to anyone until I found someone I was certain didn't belong to them. She placed the memory card in Sawyer's palm, and her hand trembled, not from the cold now, but because she was letting go of the only thing left of her husband, the thing she had protected with her life. I kept it for 5 months. I slept on it, starved on it, buried it in this coat, so even if someone searched me, they wouldn't find it. And now I'm giving it to you, a man I've known for less than an hour, because I have no other way left, and because something inside me says I'm right. Sawyer closed his fingers around the memory card, and in that moment, every scattered piece finally locked into place inside his mind, cold and clear. The ambush tonight had never been aimed only at him and his men. Though wiping out the leadership of an organization that had dared to refuse Voss was too tempting a reward to ignore, it was meant to serve 2 purposes at once. 2 problems neatly solved on the same night, in the same place. Voss had not only wanted to remove him, he had also wanted to clean out this space beneath the bridge, clean out the metal container with its marks counting days, and clean out the last living witness who knew what it was, the thin woman who had risked her life by stepping into the rain, the woman he thought would die silently beneath the bridge without anyone ever knowing her name. Sawyer tightened his grip around the memory card. He thought he'd deal with both of us in the same night, he said quietly. He miscalculated. Sawyer brought Marlene back to where the convoy was parked in the darkness, and there, 6 of his men had gathered in a silent circle around the hood of the lead car, where Dash had spread out a sheet of paper and quickly sketched by hand the lines of the harbor, the tunnel mouth, the road, the position of the blocking truck, and the cable stretched across it. They did not speak loudly. These men were used to working in the language of nods and glances, and when Sawyer stepped into the circle, all of them shifted slightly to make room for him without anyone needing to signal. He placed the memory card in the middle of the paper, where everyone could see it. Tonight isn't only about us anymore, he said quietly. Someone is being held somewhere in Voss's hands. A man died for trying to speak about it, and a woman lived for 5 months under a bridge to protect this. He touched one finger to the card. We're going to deal with the trap under the tunnel. But we do it my way. Clean, quiet, with none of us left behind here. He began pointing to the paper, his voice even and clear, assigning each task to each man in the manner of someone who had done this often enough that he did not need to stop and think. Who would take which route? Who would enter from the north side where the 2 guards on the concrete ledge could not see the darkness behind the bridge pillar? Who would handle the power feeding the work lights the ambush team had set up? Who would wait for the signal? Who would hold the exits so no one had time to call their employer? Foley, the quiet man standing at the edge of the circle, listened to every word, and when Sawyer finished giving orders, he lifted his head. What about her? Foley asked, giving a small nod toward Marlene, who stood a few steps away, still wearing Sawyer's oversized wool coat. Sawyer turned to look at her. You're going somewhere safe, he said. Right now. We have a place not far from here, private and warm. You've done your part, the hardest part, the part no one else could do. From here on, we handle it. Marlene immediately stepped forward, and the exhaustion on her face gave way to a familiar toughness. No, she said, I know that tunnel better than any of you. I've looked at it every night for 5 months. I know where the water pools, where sound carries, where someone can stand without being seen. You need me. Sawyer slowly shook his head, and his voice softened, but did not waver. You're right. You know that tunnel better than we do. But if anything happens to you tonight, then everything Russell paid for, everything you've protected for 5 months, dies with you. You're not only the only one who knows, Marlene. You're the only living person who can stand in front of people and say all of this is real. Keeping you safe isn't pushing you aside. It's protecting the strongest weapon we have. She opened her mouth to argue, then stopped, because his reasoning struck the one place she could not deny. Foley stepped out of the circle and came closer to her, speaking in the low voice he rarely used. "Let me take her," he said to Sawyer, then turned to Marlene, and something in his eyes made her pause. "You don't remember me," Foley said quietly. "That's all right. To you, I was only one person among many. But there was a night a few years ago when they brought me into the emergency room in a condition bad enough that the doctors had already shaken their heads. There was a night shift nurse who wouldn't let go, who kept holding on to me, kept working on me until I came back. I never knew her name. Not until tonight, when you stood in the road and said you used to work night shifts in the emergency room, and I looked into your eyes." He gave a small nod, a slight bow that carried deep respect. "You kept me alive once. Let me give that back to you tonight. I won't leave your side for even half a step." Marlene looked at that large, quiet man, and something inside her, the part that had gone too long without allowing herself to believe that the good she had done could ever find its way back to her, softened slightly. She nodded, just a very small nod, and this time, she did not argue anymore. Sawyer moved first, and the 5 men behind him spread out like pieces of shadow separating themselves from the night. They did not take the road. They followed the water's edge, the sides of warehouse walls, the hidden paths that only men who had spent their lives learning how not to be seen would know existed. The rain was still falling, and this time, the rain was their ally. The sound of water tapping on sheet metal roofs, and the harbor ground swallowing every small noise their footsteps might have made. The container crane rose against the black sky, a gigantic steel frame, and on its control platform halfway up, 2 figures stood watch, long guns slung over their shoulders, their eyes fixed on the road where the convoy was supposed to have come. That was their mistake. Both of them were looking in one direction, the direction from which they believed the danger would come, and neither man looked back over his shoulder, where the crane's iron ladder climbed up from the dark yard behind them. Cole, the man who had once served in the military before turning onto this road, was the one who climbed. He placed each hand on the cold, wet rungs without making a sound, shifting his weight slowly, waiting for the heaviest bursts of rain to hide any tremor in the metal. He reached the platform and stood behind the 2 shadows still staring the wrong way. And there in the darkness, he did his work cleanly and quietly, locking onto the first man and bringing him down to the steel floor unconscious before he could understand what was happening, then turning toward the second man just as he began to look back, clamping down and holding him until that body softened and went still. Cole gently laid the 2 long guns on the floor instead of letting them fall, because the sound of metal striking metal at this moment was worth a human life. He pressed a hand to his ear and spoke exactly 1 word through the radio, so softly it was almost only breath. "Done." Below, Sawyer received the signal and nodded in the darkness. The 2 highest eyes of the trap had just been blinded, and now the ambush team under the tunnel had lost the field of vision they believed they still possessed. Drift, the quiet Texan, was now beside the electrical box set against the warehouse wall, where thick cables twisted upward to feed the construction lights the ambush team had set up at both ends of the tunnel to illuminate their killing ground. He opened the box cover, the flashlight shielded inside his palm shining over the rows of breakers, and his fingers paused for 1 beat to make certain he had chosen correctly. Then he waited. He waited for Sawyer's final signal, because the timing of this moment had to match down to the second. Darkness falling at the exact instant Sawyer's men were close enough to move in, not 1 second early enough for the other side to react, not 1 second late enough for them to understand. Inside the tunnel, Sawyer, with Cole and 1 other man, had slipped through an old drainage line running beneath the road, a narrow, damp passage with cold water rising to their ankles, and they advanced little by little through absolute darkness, guided by memory and by the very sounds the ambush team unknowingly made, the scrape of a boot sole against concrete, the mutter of a man who had waited too long and was growing impatient, the faint clink of metal when someone shifted his grip on a gun. Every whisper of movement was a small lamp in the gloom, drawing for Sawyer the location of each man standing there. He stopped when he was close enough, so close he could hear the breathing of the nearest one, and he raised his hand to the radio, his thumb resting on the button. He drew in 1 slow breath. Then he pressed the button twice, 2 very soft clicks. In an instant, the lights at both ends of the tunnel went out. The entire stretch of tunnel sank into thick darkness, and with that darkness, chaos exploded at once among the men who had just discovered that they had been standing in the wrong kind of night all evening, without ever knowing it. Darkness was Sawyer's weapon, and he had chosen it from the beginning. while the ambush team, suddenly robbed of light, was still stumbling, their eyes temporarily blinded by the brightness that had just vanished. His men had long been used to the dark, had stood in it, breathed in it, and now moved through it like fish through water. Sawyer stepped up from the mouth of the drain, and the nearest man, the one whose every breath Sawyer had been hearing all this time, had not even managed to turn before Sawyer locked onto him from behind, one arm coming around, one decisive hold, and the man's body buckled onto the wet tunnel floor, his gun slipping from his hand and falling into a puddle before it could spit out a single bullet. The only sound was the soft splash of water, swallowed into the rain outside the tunnel. At the other end, Drift and the man with him did their part with the same silence, separating two men standing close together and bringing each one down before they could call each other's names. One of the ambushers finally gathered himself enough to pull the trigger, and a sharp, deafening shot rang out, the bullet biting into the concrete ceiling and sending a fragment down, but that shot had been fired into darkness, into empty air, into fear rather than at any true target, and all it did was betray the shooter's position. Cole, who by then had descended from the crane and was closing in from the north, followed the flash of the muzzle fire itself, and only a few seconds later, the man who had fired found his gun knocked upward toward the sky and stripped from his hands, found himself forced face first against the cold wall, both arms twisted behind his back. The ambush team began shouting to one another in the dark, calling names, throwing panicked questions about who was still standing and who had fallen, and those very cries ruined them all over again, because every shout was a coordinate, every question was a signal, and while they drew their own map aloud for their enemy to hear, Sawyer's men moved in absolute silence, not one of them speaking, letting the darkness keep the advantage it had given them. The man in the center of the group, the leader Dash had seen through the binoculars from the warehouse roof, was the one who kept his composure the longest. He did not shout. He backed toward the box truck parked at an angle, pressed his back against its side so no one could get behind him, and listened, trying to read the fight by sound just as Sawyer was doing. But he was used to commanding fights where he held the advantage, fights where victims drove straight into the place already prepared for them, and he did not have the instinct sharpened through nights of being hunted that Sawyer carried in him. When he heard a sound to his left and swung his gun in that direction, the sound was only a small stone Sawyer had thrown, while Sawyer himself was already on the man's right, already close beside him, his hand catching the barrel and forcing it down toward the ground at the exact moment the man's finger tightened on the trigger, sending the bullet harmlessly into the tunnel floor. The two men struggled in the dark, and the leader was strong, fast, and properly trained. But Sawyer did not fight to win beautifully. He fought to end things, and he used the force of his opponent's own resistance to turn him, throw him off balance, then take him down to the tunnel floor and pin him there, one knee pressed into his back, both of the man's wrists locked tight in Sawyer's hands. In less than 2 minutes, from the moment the lights went out, the noise in the tunnel thinned and then died completely, the last sounds of struggle fading away, and the stretch of tunnel that had only moments earlier been a waiting trap now held only the heavy breathing of defeated men and the drip of water from the concrete ceiling. Dash switched on a large flashlight, and the beam swept down the length of the tunnel, revealing that the entire ambush team had been subdued, each man held down on the ground or pressed against a wall, their weapons gathered into one pile in the middle, beyond everyone's reach. Not one of Sawyer's men lay on that tunnel floor. Sawyer stood, still gripping the leader by the collar, and under the light, for the first time, he looked straight into the face of the man hired to kill him and erase the woman beneath the bridge, a face that now held none of the cold confidence Dash had seen from above. Sawyer pulled the leader upright and propped him against the side of the box truck parked at an angle, directly beneath Dash's flashlight so the beam fell straight onto his face. Now, illuminated by the stark beam, that face appeared clearly. A man in his middle 30s with sharp eyes used to giving orders. But now something in those eyes was rapidly recalculating the entire night that had gone completely wrong compared with everything he had been hired to build. "Name," Sawyer said, his voice no louder than it had been when he spoke to Marlene beneath the bridge, yet carrying a weight that seemed to make the whole tunnel fall silent to listen. The man stayed quiet, his jaw tightening in one last effort to hold on to some fragment of professional pride. Sawyer did not repeat the question. He only tilted his head slightly toward Dash, and Dash stepped closer, his massive shadow falling over the man being held, doing nothing more than standing there, because sometimes the presence of a mountain was enough to speak in place of a threat. "Brennan," he finally said. "Brennan Vance." Sawyer nodded, storing the name with the same careful attention with which he had stored Marlene's name a few hours earlier, though for a very different reason. "All right, Brennan," he said. "I'm going to tell you how tonight goes from here, because I think you're smart enough to understand when a hand has already been lost. You were hired to do a job tonight, and you failed to do it. The man who paid you isn't the kind of man who forgives failure. Right now, to him, you're no longer an asset. You're a loose end. You understand what that means." Brennan understood. Sawyer saw it appear on his face, that chilling realization that the most dangerous man to him now was not the man holding him, but the man who had hired him. Dash had already taken out his phone, and the screen glowed with the recording symbol, the lens aimed straight at Brennan's face beneath the light. "This is the only way you walk out of tonight still useful to someone," Sawyer said. "You tell the truth. All of it. Into this phone. Who hired you? What you were hired to do. And everything you know about the thing you were hired to clean up. In exchange, you become a man with something to bargain with before the law. Instead of a loose end someone needs to seal shut. I'm not promising you freedom. I'm only promising you that speaking is the only road left with an exit at the end." Brennan looked into the lens, then at Sawyer, and his silence stretched a few seconds longer, the final seconds of a man weighing loyalty against the money that had already abandoned him. Then he spoke. He said the first name, and it was the name Sawyer had been waiting for, the name Marlene had whispered beneath the bridge like a burden she had carried too long. "Conrad Voss," Brennan said. "I took the job through a middleman, but the money was Voss's, and the order was Voss's. He wanted your leadership gone because you refused him last spring, and he didn't forget it. But that was only half the job." He wet his lips, and the next words came faster, as if once he had opened his mouth, he wanted to pour everything out so there would be no way back from the choice he had made. The other half was the bridge. He said there was a problem under there that needed to be cleared the same night, a witness, and a container holding something no one was supposed to find. He wanted both things handled cleanly in one go, in the same place, so by morning there'd be nothing left for anyone to trace. Sawyer kept his face still, but inside him, the coldness he had felt earlier beneath the bridge returned, because now it had been confirmed by the very mouth of the man hired to do it. "That container is only one," Brennan went on, his voice dropping lower. "The network is much bigger than that. People have been brought in through the harbor in groups for years, and right now, there's a ship at the eastern berth, loading up to leave. It's not only carrying cargo. Voss knows tonight is sensitive. He wants that shipment pushed out early, wants it out of these waters before dawn. So if anything falls apart here, there'll be nothing left on land for people to find." Sawyer turned sharply toward Dash, and in that moment, the night that had seemed close to ending suddenly opened into a new front, larger, more urgent, with lives being counted down aboard a ship about to leave the dock. "What time does that ship leave?" Sawyer asked, and for the first time all night, there was something close to urgency in his voice. Brennan lifted his eyes toward the darkness overhead, as if searching through his memory, then spoke. "The tide," he answered. "They're waiting for the water to reach its highest point so the ship can clear the channel. From what I heard, it leaves before dawn, as soon as the tide peaks. From now, you have about 2 hours, maybe less." Sawyer straightened, and in that moment his entire posture changed. The unhurried calm he had carried all night, the slow rhythm of a man who had never needed to rush, vanished, replaced by the cold, sharp focus of someone who had just seen a clock begin to count down. He turned to Dash. "Leave Brennan and this whole scene with 2 men to guard it," he said quickly, his voice still not loud, but every word different now, carrying the hard finality of command in an emergency. "Tie them up cleanly. Keep the scene intact. Don't touch the container. Don't touch the cable. Don't touch anything. When the federal police get here, I want them to see everything exactly as it was. This tunnel is evidence now, not a battlefield." Dash nodded, but there was a question on his face, and he said it directly. "What about the ship?" "A ship at the eastern berth, about to leave, with people on board. 7 of us were barely enough to clear this tunnel. We're not enough to take a ship, lock down a harbor, and hold it long enough for anyone to believe us." Sawyer had already taken out his phone, and his finger paused on the screen for one beat, because Dash was right, and the truth of that forced him to do something he rarely did, something that went against the instinct of a man who survived by keeping every circle tight and controlled. He had to widen that circle. Tonight. Right now. "We don't need to take the ship," Sawyer said. "We only need to keep it from leaving the dock. A ship can't put to sea if its channel is blocked, if every harbor gate has someone standing there, if its own cranes refuse to release the cargo and the trucks on the pier refuse to move aside." He lifted his head, and there was a new light in his eyes. "And this harbor, this harbor is ours. Not on paper, but the people who work here at midnight, the container drivers, the crane operators, the night gate guards. Half of them are paid by us or owe us a favor, and the other half hate Voss to the bone, because they've watched him treat human beings like cargo for all these years." He began dialing, making the first call. "Voss thinks tonight he can clean everything away because he believes he's the only one who knows what that ship is carrying. He forgot that a ship needs an entire harbor full of people before it can sail, and that harbor doesn't belong to him nearly as much as he thinks." The call connected, and Sawyer spoke into the phone in short, clear sentences, without a wasted word. Waking a network most of the city did not even know existed. Not an army with guns, but something far more dangerous to a man like Voss. Hundreds of ordinary people already there at the harbor, people who had spent their lives being treated as invisible, now given a reason and a moment to stand still together. He ended the call, made the second, then the third, and each call lit another flame in a different corner of the sleeping harbor. When he put the phone away, Dash looked at him with an expression he rarely allowed to show, a mixture of caution and something almost like astonishment. "You're waking the whole harbor," Dash said quietly. "I'm waking the whole harbor," Sawyer confirmed, already striding toward the cars, his coat moving with the night wind. "And I'm also calling people a man like me should never have to call." He thought of the memory card resting in the inside pocket of his coat, of the contacts he had kept hidden for years, for situations he had sworn he would never need. A name inside the Federal Bureau, a journalist he had once spared instead of silencing. Tonight, for the first time, he would use them all, because there was a ship waiting for the tide, and on it were human beings whose time was running out with every dark rise of the water. The eastern harbor did not wake to the sound of alarms, but to something slower and far more impossible to stop, to the people who had already been there all night suddenly, all at once, ceasing to do the work they had always done. The first was a tractor-trailer driver named Mason, a man who had been driving containers in and out of this harbor for nearly 20 years, and who owed Sawyer a favor from the days when his daughter had been sick and he had no money for hospital bills. When his phone rang in the night, and the familiar voice on the other end said only one sentence, that it was time, Mason did not ask a single question. He let his tractor-trailer, heavy with dozens of tons of weight, roll into the middle of the only road leading to the pier, then shut off the engine, pulled out the key, slipped it into his pocket, and sat quietly in the cab. A vehicle like that, placed in the right spot, was a wall. Nothing on that dock could move for the next few hours. Then came the second truck, the third, from different lots, with different drivers, all receiving the same call, all moving their vehicles out to block a lane, a gate, a turn, until the ship loading at the eastern pier was locked behind a maze of giant steel bodies it could not possibly slip through. High above, the gantry crane operator, a woman named Reyes who had been sitting in the cab through the entire night shift, received the signal and did something she had never done in her life. She locked the steel arm of the crane in place directly above the ship's deck, lowered an empty container across the mouth of the cargo hold, then pulled the controller and climbed down, leaving the machine standing there like a giant hand laid across the ship's escape route. The captain and Voss's men on deck shouted through the radios, giving orders, making threats, offering promises. But not one crane moved, not one truck backed away, not one gate opened, because the network Voss had looked down on for so many years, the invisible people he had believed knew only how to lower their heads and accept their pay, had all raised their heads tonight and said no through the simple force of standing still. Sawyer and his men arrived when the position had already been locked tight, and they did not have to open the way with violence, because the way had already been opened for them by hundreds of ordinary hands. He walked onto the pier, passing workers standing in silent rows along the dock. The sun darkened in weary faces of people who worked through the night, and in their eyes he saw something Voss's money had never been able to buy: the unity of people finally allowed to do what was right. Voss's men on the ship, seeing the dock sealed in and seeing the force below the pier growing larger with every passing moment, understood that tonight's departure would never begin. and one by one they set their weapons down on the deck as Sawyer's men came aboard, because fighting now would only bring them the worse end of a hand already lost. Sawyer was the one who opened the door to the cargo hold below. Inside, in the cramped space of the ship's belly, were people. They had come from very far away, carrying on their bodies the marks of months in which nearly everything had been taken from them. But they were still sitting there, still breathing, still alive, and when the cool harbor air flowed in with the light, they lifted their eyes to the man standing in the doorway, with the caution of people who had learned that an open door did not always mean freedom. Sawyer did not step in at once. He remained at the threshold, lowered his voice to the calmest register he had, and told them it was over. That none of them had to go anywhere now, except where they wished to go, that from this moment on, they were free people again, and no one had the right to decide their fate anymore. He did not know how much of his words they understood, but he knew that a voice, when it carried the truth, could cross even the walls of language. Behind him, the harbor workers had brought blankets, brought water, brought the awkward tenderness working people offer one another when no master is standing over them, and one by one the people in the cargo hold were helped up onto the deck, up into the night sky and the rain that had finally eased, up into a city that, for the first time in a very long while, was no longer their prison. Sawyer stepped back, making room for that dignity to be returned to the people it belonged to, and as he watched them climb up one step at a time, he thought of Marlene, of Russell, of a lost notebook and a memory card that still remained, and he understood that tonight was only one half of justice. The other half was still sleeping behind the walls of a mansion, not yet knowing that its empire had just begun to fall. 4 days after the night beneath the bridge, Conrad Voss walked into the grand ballroom of the most luxurious hotel in the city wearing a tailored formal suit. Beneath crystal chandeliers and the applause of 200 guests from the most prestigious ranks of Baltimore, tonight was his night, the annual gala for the charitable foundation bearing his name, and he was about to receive a humanitarian award for his contributions to building homes for the homeless in the city. He still did not know. That was what Sawyer had counted on. Over the past 4 days, everything at the harbor had been deliberately kept quiet. The detained ship had been handled in silence. The victims had been taken away for care beyond the reach of the press, and Voss's men captured that night had vanished from contact, in a way Voss interpreted for himself as the usual silence that followed a completed job. He believed the ship had sailed that night, believed the space beneath the bridge had been cleaned out, believed Sawyer's leadership had been left lying somewhere. He stepped into the crowd with the smile of a man standing at the summit of the world he had built. Sawyer had already been in the room before him. He had not entered through the back door, had not blended into the shadows. He wore a dark suit, standing among the guests as if he belonged there, and not one person among that powerful crowd knew who the quiet man beside the bar was. When Voss approached the stage, Sawyer separated from the crowd and stepped forward to block his path. Not hurriedly, not threateningly, simply placing himself exactly where Voss had to stop. Voss looked at him, frowning slightly at an unfamiliar face, and then the instinct of a man who had spent his life reading other people warned him that something was wrong. "Do I know you?" Voss asked, his voice still carrying all its superiority. "No," Sawyer replied, "but you know a ship at the Eastern Pier. You know a bridge underpass. And you know a man named Russell Whitfield, though I doubt you ever bothered to remember his name." The smile on Voss's face stiffened for a fraction of a second. Then he recovered it, but his eyes had changed, had begun calculating. He was not a man who frightened easily. He leaned closer to Sawyer, lowering his voice so only the two of them could hear, and instead of denying, instead of reaching for his wallet, he did what truly powerful men did when cornered. He threatened. "I don't know what you think you have," Voss said quietly, "but let me tell you how this world works. I know people at every door in this city. One word from me, and anyone standing against me will discover that their past has suddenly become very interesting to a great many people. You look like a man with a past, my friend. You should think carefully about who you want to be tonight." Sawyer did not flinch. He had been waiting for exactly those words. He lifted one hand slightly, a small gesture toward Dash, who was standing beside the ballroom's sound control table, and only a second later, the speakers throughout the grand hall, which had been playing soft background music, suddenly changed to a different sound. It was Conrad Voss's own voice, clear, unmistakable, ringing out among 200 prestigious people holding glasses of wine, ordering the bridge underpass cleaned out, ordering the ship pushed out before dawn, calling the people aboard it by the exact word he always used: cargo. Russell had recorded it once when Voss thought he was surrounded only by his own people, and now it spilled through the ballroom, striking the gilded walls, falling into the crowd as it slowly sank into soundless horror. Wineglasses stopped in midair. Faces turned toward the man who had just been invited to receive a humanitarian award. Voss stood frozen, his face pale beneath the chandeliers, and for the first time in many years, the mask money had built around him fell away before the very people he most needed to deceive. At the far end of the ballroom, the doors opened, and federal agents stepped inside. Dark coats, badges glinting, moving straight toward the stage. Sawyer did not stay to watch them reach him. He only leaned close to Voss one last time and spoke, softly enough that only Voss could hear, clearly enough that he would never forget. "You spent your whole life teaching people that everyone has a price," Sawyer said. "Tonight I came only to tell you that you miscalculated one person." Then he turned his back, walked through the crowd as it parted for him, and left Conrad Voss alone with his own voice still echoing from the speakers, and with the footsteps of the law drawing closer. Conrad Voss never walked out of the circle of law that closed around him that night. The recording played in the ballroom was only the first stone, because once Russell's memory card was placed in the hands of investigators who were not in Voss's pocket, everything Russell had patiently recorded during the final months of his life began to speak. Dates, numbers, ship schedules, other recordings, all of it fitting together into an indictment no expensive lawyer could untangle. The empire Voss had spent his whole life building collapsed far faster than it had taken to create it. One subsidiary after another frozen, one account after another locked, one name after another that had once bowed to take his money now hurriedly turning away to save itself. The Voss name, once carved into hospital walls and school gates, was quietly taken down from place to place, as if the whole city were trying to forget that it had ever applauded him. But this story was never truly about the downfall of an evil man. It was about what grew up afterward. The abandoned warehouse in the Eastern Harbor, once a link in Voss's network, was seized along with the rest of his empire, and when its fate was to be decided, Sawyer's own organization stepped forward to take it. They did not turn it into anything profitable. In the months that followed, through the hands of men who had long been used to darkness, through donated materials, and through the steady labor people create when they decide to build instead of destroy, that old warehouse was stripped of its dark shell. The stained walls were repainted, the broken windows replaced, and light was brought into a place that had once held only shadow. It became a center, a place where workers who had been deceived, trapped inside false debts, stripped of both their names and their papers, could come for help, for care, for guidance in taking back what had been stolen and beginning their lives again. On the front wall, where everyone who entered could see it, there was a small bronze plaque, not showy, engraved with only one simple line, bearing the name Russell Whitfield, the man who had believed the truth was worth more than his own life. Marlene chose her own way. When everything settled, when people offered to help her regain a roof over her head, money, some measure of compensation for all she had lost, she accepted what she needed to stand on her feet again, but she refused to let herself be only someone who had been rescued. She wanted more than that. She had spent 5 months beneath a bridge not so she could become a tragic story for other people to tell, but so one day she could do something meaningful with her own hands. She began the process of restoring her nursing license, the profession that had been taken from her along with everything else during that terrible year. And when the paperwork was complete, she did not go looking for a large hospital. She returned to the center that bore her husband's name and asked to work there, caring for the very people she had risked her life to help save, because she understood them in a way few people could, understood the fear that stayed in their eyes long after the cargo hold door had opened, understood that being set free and truly feeling free were two very different journeys, and understood that sometimes what a person needed most was not pity, but someone who looked at them and saw a whole human being. She became the first person newly rescued victims saw when they were brought in, a woman with gray-green eyes who had once known what it meant to lose everything, someone who sat down at their eye level, bandaged them, and told them, in the gentle voice of a person who did not judge, that they were safe now, that things would get better from here, and that they still carried the full worth of a human being, no matter how hard the world had tried to convince them otherwise. And each time she did that, she gave back to someone else the very thing someone had once stopped his car in the rain to give back to her. That morning, In the small room at the back of the center, Marlene stood alone before the old mirror hanging on the wall. In her hands was the white nurse's coat, the one she had not worn in nearly a year, the one she had carefully folded at the bottom of a bag through the darkest months, through the nights beneath the bridge, through the cold, the hunger, through every time she had thought she would never again be the woman who had once worn it. She lifted her hands and slowly slipped them into the sleeves, one at a time, and the soft fabric touched her skin like something both familiar and strange, like meeting a part of herself she had thought was lost forever. She fastened each button slowly, and when the last button was done, she stood straight and looked at her own reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was no longer the trembling shadow who had once run into the rain that night. Those gray-green eyes still carried the watchfulness that harsh months had carved into them, and perhaps it would stay with her forever. But beneath that caution there was now something else, a steadiness, something very close to peace. She did not cry. She only closed her eyes gently and let out one long breath, the breath she had held through all those months, all those nights, all those times she had been forced to harden herself just to survive. And as that breath left her chest, it seemed that she also set down with it a part of the burden she had carried alone for far too long. At the entrance to the center, right beside the bronze plaque bearing Russell's name, there was a small glass display case. Inside it were no medals and no images of triumph. There were only two simple objects placed with reverence, the worn work boots and the pay stub torn in half. The two things found in the metal container beneath the bridge that night, kept not to stir pain, but to remind everyone who passed through this door that this place existed because of real human beings, people who had once been turned into a number, a shipment, something disposable, and that no one would ever again have to endure that in silence. From across the street, sitting in his car, Sawyer watched the woman in the white coat step out through the center's door, receive someone who had just been brought in, and bend down to their eye level with the gentle bearing of a person born to heal. He did not step out of the car. He did not need to be present in that moment, because that moment belonged to her. He only sat there quietly and watched, and for the first time in a very long while, something inside his chest, something that had remained unsteady and restless through many years, finally settled and grew still. He had done things in his life he would never tell anyone, but on the night he had stopped his car in the rain to listen to a stranger, he had been exactly where he needed to be, at exactly the moment he needed to be there. And that, he thought, was perhaps enough. In the end, this story is not a story about power or revenge, but about dignity, about the worth of a human being that cannot be bought and cannot be sold. It reminds us that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is stop and listen to someone the whole world has turned away from. That kindness does not lie in how strong we are, but in whom we choose to use that strength for, and that no matter how much life has taken from someone, their true worth remains whole inside them, waiting only for someone to see it and for one chance to rise again. Each of us, in our own way, can be the person who stops the car in the rain for someone else. If this story has touched your heart, please hit the like button and share this video with the people you love. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you can listen to more meaningful and profound stories every day. How do you feel about Marlene and Sawyer's story? What part of this story made you think the most? Please leave a few lines in the comments below, because we always hope to hear the honest feelings from deep within your heart. Thank you for taking the time to listen until the very last moment. I wish you, the person watching this video, abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and calm every day. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next stories.